Of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission Striped Bass Board. My name is Doug Grout. I'm chair of this board. I have a few things that I'd like to mention to everybody here in my opening statements here, because we do have a very important decision to make today. First of all, and most importantly, to help us not get distracted, if anybody has any cell phones with them, can you please put them on silent or vibrate right now? The second piece of information I want to make to the general public here, we appreciate you being here. And it's in regard to our public comment guidelines. I want you all to be aware that we have a procedure that is identified with our agenda. It's put at the beginning of the Commission's meeting agenda that is a public comment guidelines here. The most important is that right now this is considered an action item that has already gone out for public comment. And it is the board's intent to end the occasional practice of allowing extensive and lengthy public comments at final decision making like this. Because we've already gone out to public comment, we've had a 45-day public comment period. We've had 19 public hearings in 12 states and the PRFC. We've collected over 3,800 public comments from individuals and 34 groups and organizations. I want to assure all of you that these comments are already part of the public record. Every one of our commissioners has received not only the specific comments that were provided for us during that public comment period, but we've also gotten summaries of them, and it is something that the commissioners take very seriously, and I assure you that they have gone over every one of them. So it's going to be my policy as chair, which is what I'm given the discretion here, is that I'm going to only take public comment during the addendum procedures here when we're making decisions if a measure comes up that was not contemplated in the addendum. I'll give you an example. We have a recreational size limit of 28, 30, 32. Well, if there is a proposal by just an example, there's a motion to have a 29-inch size limit. At that point, I will take a limited amount of public comment from the people that are here. I'll get an idea of who's going to be for and who's against it, and allow people to alternate for and against. And again, I will also ask you to limit your comments to 2 minutes or less. This because we do have a lot of people here. We have a lot of work to do today. The only other time that we have on this agenda for public comment is for items that are not on the agenda. It is number 3 on our agenda item here. And so any public comments that relate to addendum 4, I'll ask you not to make those comments. I would appreciate that the only comments that are brought forward here are things that do not relate to any of the addendum 4 decisions making here. Another thing I want to make you aware of is because we have such a fair amount of time allocated for this decision making, we are going to break for lunch at between 12 and 12:15. It will be a hard stop at 12:15 because we have the heart luncheon. So no matter where we are at that point, I'm going to look at an appropriate time sometime between 12 and 12:15 to stop, and then we will resume in the afternoon after the luncheon. Finally, I'd like to turn to our executive director, since we do have a meeting-specific proxy to provide the commissioners and the public our policy concerning meeting-specific proxies' ability to debate and make and vote.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The policy is that any meeting-specific proxies cannot vote on final actions being contemplated by this board. The practice has been for meeting-specific proxies to participate in all the subsequent or all the motions leading up to a final decision by the board. So if as you work through the addendum today, there's going to be a series of decisions that lead up to the final approval of the addendum, we assume, and the meeting-specific proxies can participate in those deliberations as well as voting on all the issues leading up to the final decision. But once you get to the motion that will finally approve Addendum 4, the meeting-specific proxies are not allowed to vote under the commission process. And not to single out Kathy Heinlein, but I think Kathy's the only one that is our meeting-specific proxy for this meeting. So she's been participating that way this week and knows the rules. But thank you.
All right, thank you, Bob. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Is there any comments or changes to the agenda from the board? Yes, Rob.
I think just a comment, in order to help streamline these activities today, the Chesapeake Bay jurisdictions have distributed a white paper on 2 occasions, both at the August meeting and for this meeting. I believe it was distributed Friday evening by Tony Kearns. And before we get to the review and the final approval, I would request that just a few minutes be allowed for me to go over the Chesapeake Bay quota. And the reason I bring this up is that it is 2014. That quota was established in 1996 for 1997. I'm not sure everyone really understands what has occurred in the ensuing 17 years as far as the management efforts and what they were all about. It'd probably take about 3 minutes, and I didn't want it to be awkward where I tried to place that in the middle of one of the options. So if you would, that'd be great.
So, Rob, would you like that before we review the options?
Yes, that is a request, and it will be fairly brief, but I think it's important given what we're looking at today.
Is there any objections from the board to that? Seeing none, we'll include that change. Is there any other changes to the agenda? Seeing none, any objection to the agenda? Seeing none, it's approved. We also had in our packets today approval of the proceedings from the August 2014 meeting. Is there anybody that has any changes to that meeting minutes? Seeing none, is there any objections to approving the minutes? Seeing none, I take that as approved. The next part is the open public comment period, and as I previously stated, this is for comments that on things that are not on the agenda. So anything related to Addendum 4, we would not accept as public comment. But if you do have comment on something not related to Addendum 4, I have 3 people that have signed up: Bill Rice, Robert Brown, and Ken Hinman. And I'll take Bill Rice first. Is your item something not related to Addendum 4? Okay, can you come up to the public mic and provide that, provide your comment? And again, if you could try and keep it to a couple minutes or so, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. In my review of the addendum, I'm sorry. William Rice. I'm the Senior Commissioner on the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and I'm Chairman of the Maryland Tidal Fish Advisory Board. Upon review of the addendum, I don't think that the socioeconomic aspects have been properly addressed, and I think this is something that needs to be considered along the way. The Bay States are about 33% less quota right now than they had in 2009, and we've fished at approximately 17% lower last year than we did in 2009. And when we take these cuts back home, that's where the rubber meets the road. We have a striped bass fishing in the Chesapeake Bay. It's not a bycatch. It's a full-time fishery for some of us. It's a full-time fishery for myself. December, January, and February, 25% cut will equal about a $1,500 a week.
Excuse me, Mr. Rice, but you are specifically addressing Addendum 4 there, and I did ask that this not be, this is a time for things that are not on the agenda, and Addendum 4 is on the agenda, and so I'm going to ask if you have something that is not related to that, I'll let you continue to speak, but if you're going to speak to the economic impact from this addenda, I'm going to ask that you, I'm sure your comments have been made in the public record before, and we have received that. Do you have anything else that is not related to Addendum 4?
No, I would say not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person on the list is Robert Brown. Again, is this is something that is not related to Addendum 4? Okay, thank you.
So just bear with me a little bit if you could, please. My name is Robert T. Brown. I'm president of the Maryland Watermen's Association. I want to speak on multi-species fish management and habitat. Anytime the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission makes any change in quota, size limits, or species, it affects another, whether it's in the ocean, the bays, or the rivers. This year, the young to year index on striped bass, which is good 11, however, is more pressure on the Chesapeake Bay food chain, especially crabs. Habitat. Our grasses seem to be almost non-existent in the majority of the middle and upper bays. For example, the Potomac River, the mid and lower river, no grasses. Not a place for the small fish, the crabs, grass shrimp, which the fish feed on, to have a place to hide. Also, the grass filters the water, oxidizes the water, and we have a large problem with dissolved oxygen, which causes algae blooms and red tides. We have seen several watermen pass away this year because of Vibrio and a flesh-eating bacteria. 2 were bitten by crabs that broke their skin, 1 with a fish fin that stuck in his hand, another by a hook that they were trying to release a fish from. And there are other diseases connected to this Vibrio that it is very hard to cure once you get it with antibiotics. We need to focus more on the quality of water, as all our fish, as they lay millions of eggs in the bay and in our rivers. Why are we not getting a better young to year index on these fish? It has to do with water quality. Water quality is one thing that we can all seem to agree on in habitat that we have lost. And we need all of us together to get there. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission should have input on the water quality, because that is what determines how many fish you're going to have. To bring this up a little further on another note, if you go back to 1985 in the Chesapeake Bay, we had no restrictions on fishing whatsoever. You could fish 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's when the federal government got into it and wanted to reduce fishing effort by 55%. At that time, before it was implemented, Governor Hughes implemented a moratorium for 3 years, but it extended 5 years before it was reopened. Well, what that does to our food chain into the river, we went from a 12-inch minimum size to an 18-inch minimum size. That fish feeds another 1 to 2 years before it is even harvested by the commercial or the sports fishermen. We're all in this together. And that is a reduction from 12 to 18 inches. If you don't count the pounds, you always count the pounds. No, count the number of fish. The number of fish reducing from 12 inches to 18 inches is like 50%. Most of the fish in the Potomac we catch or in the bay are 3.5 pounds average. That brings us to a 75% reduction in fish, the animal itself. And that's what we are all here to protect, is the fish. The pounds throw a falsehood on it. We are taking less and less fish, yet we're still catching the same amount of pounds.
Could you wrap it up?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
I just want to say that for us to stay into the seafood industry, we need crabbing, oystering, fishing, and clamming. That's the only way we make our living. And the rockfish in the state of Maryland bring in about a little over $3.5 million to the commercial, and the crabs bring in $14 million or more to the commercial industry, and we need to keep our industries going. And we have less anchovies for them to feed on, which was the smaller rockfish feed on. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you take it into consideration in all your deliberations.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ken Hinman next. And Ken, yours is something not on the agenda related to Amendment Addendum 4. Thank you.
I feel like I'm stepping onto the Gong Show or something here. My name is Ken Hinman. I'm president of Wild Oceans, and thank you for giving me a chance to make a brief comment. About 35 years ago, I helped organize a symposium on striped bass, and it was Marine Recreational Fisheries 5, for those of you who may have been in Boston in 1980 or may have a copy of the proceedings. One of the keynoters there was Richard Frank, who was then the head of NOAA. And he was the first, in my career, he was the first high-ranking government fisheries official I heard talk about ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And he talked about it quite a bit, and it made sense in that context because at that time we had panels trying to figure out what was happening to striped bass, what were the causes. We had overfishing, we had loss of estuarine habitat, toxicants in the water, acid rain. And Dr. Frank actually made a bold prediction that within a few years he expected that all of our fishery management plans would be addressing these issues and taking an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. We're not there yet, but looking back over the last 35 years, I really believe that no other species, with the exception of a few members of our own, has done more to broaden our approach to managing coastal fisheries than has the striped bass. It was our first success story of rebuilding a fish that was on the brink of disappearing, and it proved that we could do this for other depleted species. The effort to save striped bass had real tangible changes to our interstate federal system that has benefited all of our coastal migratory species over the years that don't know any boundaries. It galvanized a lot of fishermen to get involved in efforts to clean up the bays, to protect habitat. And of course, the link to menhaden in particular really kicked off what is now today a national movement to protect a lot of prey species that other species rely on. In August, Lewis Daniel called the striped bass the flagship species of this commission. And keeping that flagship afloat means not just passing the addendum that shall not be named, but also continuing to rebuild menhaden, to protect river herring and shad and other species. This commission's efforts to move and to develop an ecosystem-based approach to managing all of its fisheries, to develop ecological reference points. These are all really important things, and I think what Dr. Frank was imagining, and sadly he passed away earlier this year, but so I think the message here is that when you save this fish, you're not just saving a fish. And I wanted to thank you and tell you to keep up the good work.
Thank you, Ken. That's the only person I had on the sign-up list. Anybody else have anything that's not on the agenda? Seeing none, then we'll move into the next agenda item, which is draft addendum 4. Commissioners, you'll see that Mike Wayne, our plant coordinator, has drafted a decision tree here for us, and I just want you to be aware of it. And I did move things around a little bit different than what is the order in the addendum to try and make for a smooth and orderly addressing of the different aspects of this addenda. Clearly, the first two major decisions we have to make are we going to approve the stock assessment reference points, the proposed F reference points. And then after we make that decision, clearly the biggest decision is whether we're going to change the amendment timeline to reduce F. After that, we'll start getting into, depending on how we make a decision there, we'll be getting into, there'll be certain pathways that we're going to be taking. One that doesn't depend on a specific pathway is on page 2 here, and these are the two decisions in 3.2 commercial quota transfers, and then 3.1 commercial quota transfers, and then 3.2. So I put those up first because that doesn't apply whether we choose 1 or 3 years or do it in 1 year or do it in 3 increments. We also had some requests from several commissioners to make this decision first. After that, you then go to depending on what our decision was on 1 or 3, we have page 3 is the decisions we'll have to make if we chose to go remain at 1 year to get to the target F, and then pages 4 and 5 are the decisions we have to make if we are going to take the alternative, if we have the alternative to go to the target F in 3 years. So that's just a general overview of the order in which we're going to make the decisions. You'll also notice, for your reference on here, with each decision there's a page number that's referenced, and that's the page within Addendum 4 that the decision is contemplated. That being said, the next item on the agenda, Rob, is yours. You want to speak to the white paper that the Bay States provided to this board.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And the 4 jurisdictions in the Bay, District of Columbia, Potomac River Fisheries Commission, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and the Virginia Marine Resource Commission, have met on separate occasions and wanted.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
Yes, I can.
Some people are having problems hearing you.
The 4 jurisdictions in the Bay did meet and wanted to share this information with the management board. Previously in August, Maryland DNR and VMRC shared a white paper with you as well. I think today what I want to highlight is maybe to clear up perhaps some misconceptions about the Chesapeake Bay Baywide quota. And I don't think, but I could be wrong, that there's anyone at the table who was part of the process in 1996. Roy, you were part of the process, huh? Okay, I was wrong. So that took 3 meetings to establish a quota. And I think one of the misconceptions that we've heard recently is that we've been able to just elevate our quota, whenever the occasion arose. And you have a graph in the white paper that shows really the progress of the quota and the harvests on the back, page 10. You need not have that in front of you, but I can tell you that over the years, the Bay has reduced the quota 4 different times in that period since 1997, especially since 2000 on your graph. The Bay-wide quota was not a great gift. It was a way to achieve some normality in the fluctuations within the Bay in harvest. It was a cap. I'm just going to tell you about Virginia. Nothing has changed with the Bay-wide quota since 1996 and what we have today. We have the same regulations. What's changed is there is a cap, and so we had to be wary, like the other jurisdictions, of the harvest. On the commercial end, the quota we have today in 2014 is no different than what we had in 1996. There was a period of about 5 years where we enjoyed about 300,000 pounds more. The other jurisdictions the same way prior to Amendment 6. We've been very judicious about monitoring that quota. The Amendment 6 calls for adhering to a fishing mortality rate target, which currently is 0.27. It does not stipulate that the Bay had to necessarily reduce its quota, but the Bay certainly had that type of vigilance. So if exploitable stock biomass showed a decrease, the Bay took action. Again, I think there's probably been some misunderstandings about the Bay-wide quota. It has had some benefits, because in Virginia, for example, we did have some years, 2003 to 2006, where our recreational fishery was doing very well. It was doing too well. Thank goodness the other jurisdictions weren't under the Bay-wide quota. We stepped in with no-take slot limits and various measures to try and calm that fishery down. Those were the words of the industry, not mine. It, of course, worked. So what I ask you today is try and look at the Bay-wide quota as an agreement, a commitment by the Bay. It worked both ways. The management board in 1996 thought long and hard about whether to approve the Bay-wide quota. It took 3 separate sessions before they did, but this is where we've been since 1997. The last thing I'll say is there has been foregone opportunity for the Bay on the recreational fisheries. There's some tables in your document that show clearly that overall the Bay has been conservative throughout that time period. The recreational harvests have been held in check. It's perfectly fine that other states were able to, along the coast, increase in their recreational harvest. That was part of the management plan. But a decision was made in the Bay to have that 10.5 million pound quota, which later became about 7.8 million pounds. So I did want to bring that out, Mr. Chairman. There are other items. I think some of the items do pertain to the decisions that we make today, and I will have some more to say about that later. Thank you very much.
Any board members have questions of Rob on this? Okay, seeing none. Tom Foti. Sorry. I think I do, Tom.
Rob, I was here since 1990, so I was around for that discussion. I was hoping that you would go into or are you going to go into this later, about the coastal migratory stocks that the Bay harvests? Or are you going to do that at a later time, or do you want to do it now? Because a lot of people don't know about that, so I think it's a good time to get that on the table, too, also.
At the pleasure of the chair, I can do that, and certainly Tom O'Connell also can do that.
What's the pleasure of the board? Do you have any objections to this at this point, or would you rather wait until we get it up? Can I get... You're okay with it? Okay, go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this time I won't make a mistake. There are actually some people who were involved in this process who are here right now. So in 1994, we had a tag-based approach to have, at that time, what was called producer areas in the coastal area, and there was a situation where it was debated by the management board on just how to handle the Chesapeake Bay's harvest of migrant striped bass. And the deliberations ended up with, at the time, Amendment 5 was adopted in 1995. The proposal was to have 25,000 fish set aside as a cap for the Chesapeake Bay. And that worked well for about a year. During the subsequent year, the overage that existed, the board came back and asked for a different approach. So the second approach was to raise that cap to 30,000 fish. And that had some challenges as well. Maryland certainly has had a very good trophy season out of all the jurisdictions. And at one point, which time does run away a little bit, but I'd say probably 10 years ago, and Tom can correct me on this, there was a proposal at the technical committee to merely look at the coastal spawning stock, and the magnitude of the coastal spawning stock would really be what would be the basis for any type of harvest in the Chesapeake Bay. And I don't know whether Tom Foti had this in mind or not, but one of the things about this addendum is really the trophy fisheries, the coastal migrant fisheries in Chesapeake Bay, really are part of the coastal spawning stock and not really part of the bay fishery. So, Tom, if you want to add anything, Mr. Chairman, that's my recollection back in the past.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, because there was some confusion, I know, Robin, you were around, Pete Hamchek is no longer here, but we're the few people that remember how that process went along, and it was a long, drawn-out process. But, yeah, I just wanted to make sure people understood where those fish came from.
Okay, thank you for that discussion. I think the next thing on the agenda we should move on to is Mike Wayne. Can you please review the options and the public comment summary?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start with reviewing the options in the addendum, and then I'll stop and take some questions, and then I'll move into the public comment summary. This is draft addendum 4. Just in terms of the timeline, the board is considering final action on this document today. We had an extensive public comment period, of which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the planned implementation was for the 2015 fishing season. Before I start moving into the document, I just wanted to try to conceptualize sort of what's in there. First is proposed new fishing mortality reference points, and if adopted, that would put us in a stock status condition in which we're between the threshold and the target for both fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass. And so given that stock status, there's a management trigger in Amendment 6 that requires the board to take action to reduce F to that new fishing mortality target. And that was within 1 year. There was a motion that passed to make an adjustment to within 3 years, allowing flexibility for the board to choose 1 or 3 years. Based on that decision, there are set timeframes that go through specific management options that would achieve the fishing mortality target in 1 or 3 years. So that's where we get into the specific options about how the coast is going to be managed, how the bay is going to be managed, and the different recreational and commercial sectors. So that's that's a broad overview, and now I'll get into all those components briefly. So in terms of the statement of the problem, we've got new proposed fishing mortality reference points. Those were coming right out of the 2013 benchmark stock assessment. Given those new proposed reference points, F is currently above the new target, and SSB has been below the target since 2006. We've observed a similar downtrend in harvest, and so to address these concerns, the draft addendum contains management options to reduce F to the target within 1 or 3 years. So these figures just walk through basically everything that I just showed you. This is a figure of spawning stock biomass through time. The solid black line across the top is our SSB target, and the dashed line is our SSB threshold. The gray dotted line that's oscillating through time is a measure of spawning stock biomass. You can see that it's been in decline and is actually quite close to our overfish threshold in the terminal year, which was 2012. The reason for this decline is poor recruitment, which is shown by the vertical bars, which is a measure of recruitment over the last 5 or so years. So not as many juveniles being produced, and therefore as they grow into become spawners, we see a decline in the spawning stock biomass. I just want to note before we leave this that we did have a strong 2011 year class, which you can see in vertical bar all the way to the right of that figure. And so part of the proposed objective is, or a couple objectives, is protecting the spawners that are out there and also considering protection of that strong 2011 year class. This figure shows fishing mortality, and you can see that our current reference points, as shown in the gray lines, we've maintained fishing mortality below that point, but even though we've done that, we've still seen this decline in spawning stock biomass. So ultimately, the question we asked in the benchmark stock assessment is, what fishing mortality rate do we need to be fishing at to get us back to that spawning stock biomass target? That's where these new proposed reference points came out of. And you can see with the solid black lines running across the figure that we are currently above our target in the terminal year. And so given that stock status, that is what's triggering management action here. Quickly go into the fisheries, start with a commercial harvest. Along the coast over the last 11 years, we've harvested just under 3 million pounds. We've had some underages from the quota because fish haven't shown up in some areas, and also some states use their commercial quota for a recreational bonus program. Additionally, in the Chesapeake Bay over the same time period, as Rob noted, they're being managed with a quota, and they have harvested approximately 4 million pounds commercially. And we also have an Albemarle Sound Roanoke River stock that has some harvest in North Carolina, around 150,000 pounds. In terms of the coastal recreational harvest, over the same time period has averaged about 26.4 million pounds, so considerably more harvests recreationally than commercially. In the Chesapeake Bay, the recreational harvest has averaged about 4 million pounds over that same time period. A bulk of the landings from the coast come from New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Maryland. So that's just a little bit of background. Now I'm going to move into those proposed reference points that I referenced on the figure. The coastal population reference points incorporates all the stocks that make up the striped bass population, the Chesapeake Bay, the Hudson River, and the Delaware. We also considered separate reference points for some of these other producer areas. In terms of the coastal population reference reference points. These are the reference points that were proposed that came directly out of the 2013 benchmark assessment. And so the two options here are status quo, the current reference points, or the 2013 benchmark reference points that bring us back to that spawning stock biomass target. Now, previously we've had a separate reference point in terms of fishing mortality for the Chesapeake Bay because that area was harvesting on smaller fish. And so to allow for that, they took a penalty in fishing mortality or a reduced fishing mortality rate. And so ultimately, the technical committee tried to develop Chesapeake Bay specific reference points through the coming out of the benchmark assessment, but they were unable to do that because there are various issues in terms of not knowing exactly what the proportion of male-female sex ratio, and then also the reference points that came out of the benchmark assessment for the coast actually incorporate the mortality on those smaller fish. And so they made the recommendation, having not been able to develop the reference points, to use the coastwide population because they adequately account for that harvest on the smaller fish. Now, in terms of the Albemarle Roanoke stock, North Carolina at the August board meeting presented a stock-specific assessment for the Albemarle Roanoke stock. They have established both spawning stock biomass and fishing mortality targets and thresholds, and plan to use a quota to manage that stock at those target levels. So the board previously approved that proposal to do so at their August meeting. And it's thought that the Albemarle Roanoke stock does not contribute significantly to this coastal migratory stock that we talked about. So that's the reference points. Now moving into the timeline to reduce F to the target if the new reference points are adopted. And as I mentioned, there is a management trigger that requires the board to act within 1 year to do that. There's an option that was added to do it within 3 years, and that would allow flexibility for these different timeframes that I'm about to talk about. So those are the two options here, but this is where ultimately we decide, or excuse me, the board decides whether to act within 1 year or allow a flexible 3-year approach. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of each of the options because I'm going to do that in the public comment summary, but I just wanted to mention that there's timelines that have both commercial and recreational management options that going forward. And so option A, as always is the case, is status quo, keep the fishery exactly how it is now. Option B is this 1 year time frame to reduce F to the target. To do that, that's going to require a 25% reduction in harvest. Option C is a 3-year time frame to reduce F to the target, and this time frame takes a reduction all up front, a 17% reduction, and then holding that constant through time, F ends up being reduced to the target over 3 years. The last time frame is what we're calling a stepwise 777% reduction, in which F would be reduced F would be reduced to the target in 3 years through an incremental reduction in harvest. I'll mention that given the projections, all of these time frames have a 50% probability of achieving F target over their specified time frames. Another question that came up a lot is what happens after the 3 or the 1 year period? And these harvest levels after the reduction would remain in place until the board took another management action to change it. So although the time frames talk about reducing F to the target, the harvest levels would remain constant after the reduction. So this is where I mentioned that the recreational fishery has options for the coast bag size trophy fish options that I'm going to get in specifically when I talk about the public comments. And then the Chesapeake Bay has bag size limits and quota options as well for the rec fishery. And then the commercial fishery has, for the coast, reductions from Amendment 6 quota for all those timeframes, and then the Chesapeake Bay has reductions from either 2013 quota levels or 2012 harvest. Now, the reason that 2012 harvest is considered for the Chesapeake Bay is because in 2013, the Bay took a 14% reduction from their quota because the way they established their quota as biomass decreases exploitable, they also decreased the quota. So they took a reduction in 2013. So because it would be compounding to add the time frame reduction on top of that, it was included to take the reductions from 2012 harvest. Just wanted to go back quickly to the spawning stock biomass. So if you remember at the in the terminal year, spawning stock biomass was trending below that overfish threshold, and that's all this figure shows is a continuation of what we anticipate to happen. These are medium projections through time. So we expect spawning stock biomass will fall below its overfish threshold under all of these harvest reduction scenarios. So if you're looking at the figure, the line that's the dashed and dotted line, the bottom line of those four as they split apart, is the status quo option. One up from that, the dotted line is this incremental 777% reduction. The solid line is the 17% reduction 3-year time frame. And then the most conservative reduction time frame is the 1-year 25%, and that is anticipated to bring spawning stock biomass back up to its threshold and ultimately its target the quickest. Now, there is some uncertainty in these projections, but they are median condition projections. So the last two the last two items are the commercial quota transfers, which would apply to any of the time frames selected. Those quota transfers, right now, currently, commercial quota is not allowed to be transferred between states. Option B would allow for the transfer of commercial quota between states upon agreement, like we have in some of our other fisheries that we manage. And then the commercial size limits are also a provision that's considered regardless of the time frame. The way Amendment 6 was written is if the board adopts status quo and they happen to choose a different size limit for the recreational fishery, that would mean that the commercial fishery would need to change to match whatever the size limit of the recreational fishery is. That's the status quo option. The plan development team wrote in an option B, which is keep the current size limits as is, regardless of a change in the recreational size limit. The reason being is that ultimately there's a lot of states that have developed gear restrictions that are specific to the size limit that we currently have. The time frames consider reductions to quota, and so the plan development team felt that was acceptable, so we didn't want this situation in which unnecessary discards would occur from a change in the size limits. So we wrote in an option to allow states to maintain their current size limits. So just a final note that the board will need to consider the compliance schedule based on any decisions that they make for the options. So I'll pause briefly for some questions before I go into the public comment summary. Thank you.
Any questions, Rob? All right, keep your hands up so I can take it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mike. And just very quickly, protecting the 2011 year class will be a challenge, given that it's a lot of bycatch and bykill that will go on. And, on the commercial side, without gear out of the water, we found in the past that it makes an elongated process to do protection. So conservation is definitely what we're looking for. Wanted to just update the management board in case you did not receive the press releases. Both Maryland and Virginia, Young of the Year for 2014 was statistically average. I think in the case of Virginia, it was actually numerically higher than the average, but within the 95% confidence interval, it's statistically average. Same with 2013. I realized that graph you had, Mike, was developed a while ago showing 2011, but 2012, if you don't know, was not a good year in Chesapeake Bay in either the Maryland or the Virginia portion, but I can look at the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences plot here and see that in the last 10 years, except for 2012, at least in Virginia, it's been average, close to it, or, of course, very above average with that 2011 year class. So I just wanted to make that note.
Do you have a question?
No, comment.
Okay, we're taking questions right now, and the next person on the list is Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. One is that going back to the SSB projections table on page 11, would you agree that the projections that were shown there, or going back to 2012, 2013, due to the historic retrospective bias, the model has shown that when the next stock assessment comes out, if history is any teacher of us, we would see that black line, at least for 2012 and 2013, there's a good chance it would be at a higher level of SSB than what we're currently seeing in this chart based on the history of that bias in the model.
Yeah, I'll give it a try, and if Charlton wants to add anything, he can. Yeah, so there is a retrospective bias, which is a conservative bias in the assessment. And so the magnitude of the SSB may change, but ultimately the trend that we're seeing, we expect to remain intact. So although SSB could be slightly higher, or actually could be lower, we do expect that trend of downward trend from those poor year classes coming into SSB will continue until that strong 2011 year class becomes part of SSB and it starts to rebound.
Great, thanks for focusing on that point about the trend, but the relative to where it is to the SSB threshold is something we'll definitely be considering as we move forward. And the second question has to do with conservation equivalency. On page 10 in the document, the opening paragraph of section 3.0 talks about the availability of conservation equivalency. The table on page 14 listing the options for option B has in parentheses all jurisdictions would implement. So I think we just need to be very clear on the record for the audience that the options we select today may not be the options that individual states implement, and that phrase, all jurisdictions would implement, really only means in the absence of them bringing forward a conservation equivalent proposal, and just wanted confirmation of that.
Yeah, exactly. That, as you're aware, through Amendment 6, there were conservation equivalency proposals that were submitted and accepted and are currently in place. We're not taking that flexibility away that always exists in our management plans. And so ultimately the board will choose what we call the new baseline, but conservation equivalency proposals could be submitted, reviewed by the TC, and ultimately accepted by the board.
Great, and if I could have one short follow-up to that.
Go ahead.
The option that would be chosen, would it set a new percentage requirement for the proposals put forth? And what I mean by that is if we go with a 25% reduction, a one-year reduction, but chose option B1, which has a 31% reduction, are conservation equivalent proposals then required to be brought forth at the 25% for the one-year reduction or for the 31% as we selected with a specific option?
Yeah, good question, Adam. I think that the board is going to make that distinction when they select an option for what the baseline is going to be. Ultimately, the projection suggests the percent reduction is, depending on the time frame, I'll use your example, the 25% for the 1 year. So that's what the projections suggest are necessary. There are size and bag limits that try to achieve exactly that percent, but because of the stepwise function of that, they might be a little higher or lower. So I think the board intends to clarify whether the conservation equivalency proposals would have to achieve a 25% reduction or the reduction that was associated with whatever option they selected as the baseline.
Yes, and I believe there will be a motion so that the board can debate that concept and clarify that for the technical committee when they determine what conservation equivalency is. So my next person on the list is Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also for rearranging the order in which we're going to look at the options as we go through this document. Mr. Chairman, I have 3 questions for Mike. I'd like to ask at least 2 of them, and if you'd like, I can hold back on the 3rd question until you come back around again.
I don't intend to come back around, so I think you should, again, these are just questions. I'd like you to get them all over with, and then we can, so we can move on to the next agenda item, which is public comment. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, thank you for the excellent presentation, and thank you also for the good job that you did at the public hearing in New York with a lot of people there and a lot of comments. So thank you, Mike. My first question is relative to the graphic that you have up there. The driver in those projections is really the 2011 year class, driving that, as well as reductions in fishing effort. So my question to you is, between the 3 non-status quo options, is there a statistically significant difference in those 3? In your presentation, you said there's a lot of variance around those, and that's what I would guess would be that there's a lot of variance, and that the error around each one of those projections probably overlap each other. So again, my question there is there a statistically significant difference between the 3 non-status quo options?
Yeah, for simplicity, we didn't include the variability around each of these median projections, but if we did, they would overlap, and so we haven't formally done the analysis, but given that the confidence intervals would overlap for each of these projections, they are not statistically different from each other. Thank you.
My next question has to do with the commercial quotas that are listed under the different options for both, the 1 year and the 2, 3-year options. 2-part question, I guess. One is, those quotas are based on a 28-inch minimum size. Is that correct?
The Amendment 6 quotas, is that what you mean? Sorry, I missed.
Well, yes, the Amendment 6 quotas, and then the reduction that would result from the 3 different timeline options for the commercial quota.
Yeah, so the Amendment 6 quotas are coming out of Amendment as the average commercial harvest from 1972 to 79. And those are the quotas that went in place with Amendment 6, and they are using a 28-inch minimum size limit, yes.
Thank you. And since those quotas are based on numbers of fish, as I understand it, and the assessment is based on numbers of fish, if there were to be a higher minimum size for the commercial fishery, higher than 28 inches, would those quotas then need to be adjusted upward in terms of pounds to account for harvesting the same number of fish but at a larger size?
Yeah, I guess if the board decides to change the commercial size limit from what they have now, then they could also decide to change the quotas to account for that change in the size limit. So ultimately, as the size limit increases, you're going to be harvesting less fish under the same poundage amount because those fish are going to be larger. So if the board wanted to account for that and adjust the quotas, they could.
Thank you. And my last question is, in the document, it says that harvest is down, total harvest is down 19% since 2008. And one of the tables in the stock assessment document shows that 2008 was the highest total catch in the entire time series. It's probably biologically unlikely that the resource can sustain that 2008 harvest level. Would that be a correct assumption?
So based on, well, I guess it means, what do you mean biologically sustain it? It can sustain it, but your population size would be lower than like you could fish at that level. According to the reference points that we propose in the new addendum, you could fish at that period of time was overfishing. So yes, in that sense, to maintain it at the population size, excuse me, to maintain the population at the size that the board has established as the threshold, then no, it could not sustain that level of harvest. So during that, according to the reference points that we've proposed, that was overfishing.
Follow up?
You're getting into more than 3 questions, but go ahead. This is your last shot.
So then it would be unrealistic for people to assume that we're, regardless of what we do today, that catches are going to go back to that level.
So there's a combination of things at play here, and one of them is the low recruitment that we've seen in recent years, and that's part of what is driving that decline. So it's not strictly the sense that overfishing is driving that decline, but if we fish at the target and we see sort of your long-term average recruitment, then we could get back to population size at the target that could sustain. I can't go back and tell you exactly how close you could get to that level. It was not extreme overfishing, but you could probably get close. We haven't done that kind of, what is the MSY or what is the yield that you could expect, but it's not outrageously unsustainable, at least according to the reference points that we have proposed.
Jim, you were next on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, and thank you for the flow chart. I think this is terrific, and you probably should make an iPhone app for it. You'd make a lot more money than what we're going to make with us. I only have one question, but I just wanted to follow up with a comment on Rob. We've had he provided info on the Chesapeake spawn the last couple of years. We've had poor spawns also in 2012 and 2013 in the Hudson. However, in 2014, we have an above average spawn from the preliminary data we've looked at. So just so everyone's got that piece of information. My question is simply, and I'll refer the graph up there on the board, is that I checked with Tony. The next stock assessment is an update in 2017, and then I imagine the next one after that would be a 5-year period. So I'm really focusing on the decisions we make today, how long we're going to be living with them. So I extended the lines last night on your different projections on 25 versus 777. And if we take the 25 in 1 year, we hit the threshold in 2017 based upon my rough line. So what we do today is important, but when we're going to be able to reassess this, the earliest would be 2017. So if we take the 25% reduction in 1 year, we may hit the threshold in the next stock assessment. If we do something lower and those lines hold, then we're looking at 7 years, I guess, or 8 before we would actually have data to adjust what we were doing here today. Is that correct thinking, or is there other things we could do to adjust this earlier?
Yeah, I mean, the board has flexibility through the adaptive management process or the addendum process to make changes at any point. Frequently, that's done from the results of a stock assessment. We usually do for striped bass a benchmark every 5 years and an update every 2 or so years. So technically, we'd be planning for an update in 2015. It's actually something that we've asked to be talked about today because the TC currently has the task of developing Chesapeake Bay reference points. The board is considering a management action today that would change the management program, and so an assessment in 2015 would only have data through 2014. So do they want to wait? Does the board want to wait to get more information before we do another stock assessment, considering that we have Chesapeake Bay reference points to focus on in the meantime? Those are the types of things we were hoping to get some clarity from, but ultimately, back to your original question, I think it depends on how many years the board would like to see under this new whatever ends up happening before they look at another stock assessment.
Okay, I have Dave Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that the Bay States took some percent reduction in their quota from 2012 to 2013. I missed that percentage, and I wondered if, in addition to providing that, if you could tell me or someone from the Bay States could tell me how they accomplished the reduction.
Yeah, the reduction was 14%, and I'll let Rob correct me if I'm wrong on that. But and ultimately, they use their quotas to manage both their commercial and recreational fishery, and so staying within or under that quota would achieve that reduction. But they have been harvesting under their quota somewhat anyways, so maybe they can provide a little bit more clarity on that.
Okay, yeah, I just wondered if there was a shortening in a season or something like that would be informative. If someone can provide a quick answer to that, that'd be great. And then I just had one quick question for Katie.
Tom, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, David. That reduction was made through a reduction in the commercial fisheries quota that we manage year to year. The recreational fishery has been tracking abundance, with a constant management strategy, so their harvest has been fluctuating up and down. So some of that reduction was because the recreation performance decreased. The other part is that the commercial quota was dropped.
David, follow-up?
Okay, so that helps. So there's a hard quota with commercial, and you're able to manage that. So that makes good sense. And then, Katie, I remember from our discussion in August that there was a data limitation that prevented you from being able to calculate a percent reduction associated with minimum sizes greater than 28. So for the 32-inch option, which a number of people have commented we can't provide a % reduction associated. Talking on the side with Paul, he thought that 4-inch difference might be a year or two difference in age.
Right. We can do it if it's. We cannot do the combination of the bag limit and the size limit. So basically, we cannot calculate the reduction going from 2 fish at 28 to 1 fish at 28 or 1 fish at 32. That combination is because of data limitations. But we can do it if we're just keeping the bag limit the same, but going to a different size limit. So 2 fish at 28 versus 2 fish at 32, and that information should all be in the table. But it's when you try to combine the bag and size limit changes that we run into data limitations.
Martin, you're next on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have 2 questions, if I may, with your permission. And the second one is a 2-part, but I promise you it'll just be 2 parts. Before we get my first question, Mike, could you bring up the juvenile index that you had, the juvenile reproduction index over time that you referred to? Can you get to it? Okay. So I'll go ahead and continue to talk. So while you were describing this in general terms, Mike, you referred to, I believe, in general, the time frame from the mid-2000s up to the present as recruitment being poor. And I would agree with you that the 2012 year class was a poor year class of reproduction. And in general, that time frame has been inferior to the time frame in the 90s up to, say, 2004, 2005. But was the term poor, your choice of words, subjective, or is that by definition? That was my first question. Or would you rather refer to that as lower than average?
Yeah, I mean, if you prefer lower than average, that would work.
Well, it isn't prefer. It goes to my next question. I just want clarification. I think a lot of people think that, at least the ones I've talked to, constituents and other folks that I've met up here, that there's some issue going on there that really has been pointed. Certainly, it is concerning, and you're absolutely right. I think everybody here at the table, as this discussion progresses, will agree that recruitment's the issue. But my follow-up question, which is 2 parts, and it goes to either Charlton, Katie, or Mike, either of you, is for the current level of SSB as it is right now. How does that compare to the early 1990s, 92, 93, 94? And my point is, back then, that SSB at that level back in the early 90s produced 3 of the most dominant year classes in the history of the juvenile index, the 93, 96, and 21 year classes. So is the level of SSB at the present time higher, lower, about the same as the early 90s that produced those dominant year classes?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the figure, you can see that in the early 90s, SSB was roughly about the level that we currently have. The threshold that we use is the spawning stock biomass in 1995, which was the year that we declared striped bass rebuilt. And so I think what your question is there levels of SSB that are lower than what we have now that also are capable of producing strong year class? And the answer to that is yes.
Okay, so the follow-up, and I guess it's subjective, is under the new fishing mortality rates that we'll walk out of the meeting with today, presumably we'll get elevated levels of SSB, but there's not necessarily a guarantee that that will result in dominant year classes. Would that be correct?
Yeah, there's a weak stock recruitment relationship, which just means that it's not a given that higher SSB is going to produce higher juveniles.
All right, thank you.
Number of juveniles.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Kyle?
Yeah, I'd like to know if there can be, we talked about the biological reference points for the Chesapeake Bay, and I was wondering about the timetable. You know, can we revise the biological reference points? And if yes, when do we think we might be able to deliver on that and get an idea of being able to do that for the Chesapeake Bay region?
Yeah, so as I talked about in regards to the stock assessment, one of the tasks that came out of the August board meeting was to continue with development of the Chesapeake Bay reference points. And the TC plans to have an in-face meeting in November to continue that development. As I mentioned, we're technically on the books for a stock assessment update in 2015, but given that there's been a task of developing Chesapeake Bay reference points, does the board want us to continue on that task or switch over to doing an assessment update? It would be difficult, if not impossible, to do both of those things in the same year. So I think it ultimately depends on the prioritization at the board level of which they prefer, and then also in terms of when can we deliver on those, assuming that the task ends up being focused on Chesapeake Bay reference points as quickly as we can do that. So that will be at all the TC meetings that we have in 2015. We will continue to have the TC to meet until they can deliver on that task.
Tom O'Connell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two, I think, quick questions. Under the coastal commercial management options, the addendum makes it very clear that those options will not achieve the desired reduction. But there's a follow-up sentence that says, however, if there may be some level of reduction from 2013 harvest if the fishery performs similar to previous years. Just wondering what that some level of reduction might be. Are you able to kind of put that in some quantification? Is it going to be 5%, 10%, 20%?
I can't remember. I think we prepared it for the August board meeting. Let me take a look at my files and try to get you an answer. Ultimately, it would be a reduction from the states that are harvesting right to their quotas, right? So if states aren't harvesting right up to their quota, then a reduction in quota is not going to impact their harvest. If states are harvesting right up to their quota, their harvest would be impacted by a quota reduction. So let me take a look, Tom, and hopefully I'll be able to get back to you. But just generally speaking, looking at the quotas and the harvest levels and the figures, you can probably see which states would be impacted.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I think that would be helpful information to have as we look at equity between the different sectors. My quick note suggests that it would likely be 5% reduction if North Carolina does not catch their allocation, which they haven't, it may be 19%. So just a point that it's going to be below 25%. My follow-up question is, as the board and the working group of this board developed the public information document, we were trying to keep this document relatively simple, and there was a conversation about if we're looking at 1 year time frame, a 3-year time frame, obviously 2 years is within that time frame, and the working group thought that it would overly complicate the document to add that additional time frame, but it would be within the range. And just want to ask, I know you have this question, answer this question, Mike, if the board looked at a 2-year time frame, we know that at 1 year is 25%, at 3 years 17%. What would the level of reduction be required in the first year? Is it 20%?
Yeah, it was 20 or 21% reduction for the 2-year time frame.
Dave Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on Jim Gilmore's comment on the SSB chart, if I might. Under the 3-year phase-in strategy, I'm just curious, and this is a question, will our scientific advisors have the ability to measure annually whether or not we're achieving a 7% cut? And if the answer to that is no, then the second question is, in what year would we be able to measure the cumulative impacts of those cuts?
Yeah, so ultimately, I'll explain it in terms of the sectors of the fishery. With the commercial harvests, we have the tagging of commercial fish and a good estimation of the pounds that are being harvested. So in the following year, to assess sort of the reduction, we could use that data. For the recreational fishery, we're going to be relying on MRIP estimates to do that. And so ultimately the question or something that I wanted to mention is the uncertainty in the MRIP estimates of harvest going to inhibit our ability to estimate whether a reduction has been achieved or not? So that's something to consider, is that there's more uncertainty in the recreational harvest data than there is in the commercial, and noting that the recreational harvest is higher than the commercial harvest.
And maybe I'm missing it. I'm not quite sure. Let's assume that we can't measure it annually. At what point, how many years would it take for the scientific community to have confidence that we had achieved those cuts over time? Is it going to be 2 years after the final cut, or 1 year after the final cut, 3 years after the final cut?
Yeah, in terms of achieving the harvest reduction, that is, we could evaluate that on an annual time step with looking at the harvest numbers, which we do annually for all our species through our FMP reviews. But in terms of how is that going to relate us back to what our estimates of fishing mortality are and spawning stock biomass, we would rely on a stock assessment to tell us or to estimate where we are at with both fishing mortality and SSB, and ultimately that would just depend on when it is we update the stock assessment.
So I have Rob Ritchie, Bill Goldsboro, and Tom Foti on the list. Rob, I'm going to give the people that haven't spoken first an opportunity first, and then we'll get to you. Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to follow up on the train of thought that Tom O'Connell was going down. If a coastal recreational size limit was picked, let's say 1 at 32, which would be more conservative than 128, if you combine the savings that option would take with the commercial harvest, isn't there a high probability then that the combination of those two would reduce mortality by at least 25%?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you're not achieving it from the commercial fishery, it can be achieved from the recreational fishery, with the caveat that there is some uncertainty involved with each of those management options. And so although we're estimating the percent reduction that would be associated with that option, there is noted uncertainty in that reduction.
Bill Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to put a finer point on, Mike, your response to Marty a minute ago on where we are right now with SSB and how that compares to where we were in the early 90s, specifically in 93 when we produced the record year class shown there as 1-year-olds in 94. And then to use that as a frame of reference for where we're projected to go in the next few years, and I'll ask you to turn to that chart in a minute. But using the SSB units on that chart, which was thousands of tons, if I'm not mistaken, where we were in 93 when we produced our record year class was 42,000 metric tons. And the threshold level where we are now is 57,000 metric tons. And correct me if I'm wrong on either of those, but could you turn back to that other chart, the projection chart, for a second? Okay, thank you. I don't know the exact number, but just trying to read this chart, it looks like if you take the status quo line as maybe the firmest projection we have, it looks to me like that's around 47,000 metric tons. Is that a fair judgment from that chart? So something like that. But the point was that I think it's a useful frame of reference as we look at the options and where they may take us in the next few years, that all of them are still well above that level that produced that record year class in '93. Thank you.
Yeah, as we talked about, strong year classes have been produced from lower SSB than what we have now.
Tom Foti.
Yeah, I had my hand up early and guess you missed it again, but a lot of the questions were answered. I just wanted to comment on the public hearing process for one second.
We're going to get to the public hearing comments here soon. Do you have a question for Tom? I mean, for Mike?
Well, I also wanted to get Russ to basically tell us what the Delaware River is doing, what it did this year and the Young of the Year.
Okay, Russ.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know the Delaware doesn't get its just due sometimes, but we're not seeing as many problems in the Delaware as in some of the other systems. And for this year, the Delaware, we're not finished yet. We have a crew out today doing the last day, but we're already the 8th highest index in the history since 1980. And that will give us 4 top 10s since 2007. So we have a very good young year classes coming through the system in the Delaware, and it's probably helping drive some of that recruitment that is being shown in the figures up there. So thank you very much.
Okay. Rob, you've got a question. This will be the last question on this before we go to the public hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And these are follow-up questions that, first of all, I was asked as one of the Chesapeake Bay representatives to respond to Dave Simpson. Tom O'Connell responded, but what I wanted to say on that item was that, yes, after 2006, there was tracking by the recreational fishery with abundance, but before then, measures such as one fish in December, which is a big wave in Virginia, no take slot limits, season curtailment, all those were in play because each jurisdiction has its own regulation concerning their own part of the quota. So I wanted to clear that up a little bit. I also wanted to, there's been a lot of conversation about stock recruitment, and I guess I would ask the technical folks whether, or despite the fact that it's been asserted that high and low recruitment, you might end up with high recruitment, you might not, it might be medium, and the comments of Bill Goldsboro about 1993. However, I think there is a line in the sand, and I think once you get below 30,000 metric tons, that there's pretty good evidence that your recruitment is not going to be very strong. And that's a question if you've looked at the data, but otherwise I want to feed that into what Dave Borden asked about, and my perception is you will not know. It's sort of like Excel solver. You're waiting for the answer. You do the assessment. If the answer is there, that you've reduced the F, that's fine. You won't know whether it's abundance changes. You won't know whether it's discard changes, since we're not really looking at reducing catch, we're looking at reducing harvest. So I think that's typical to our summer flounder management, that proceeds the same way. And what we typically do there, and what may happen here, is if the assessment shows the progress hasn't been made, try again. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you get your questions answered?
Pardon me, Mr. Chairman. I did answer myself, but I invited the technical folks, if they had information about that 30,000, to go ahead and...
Would the technical committee like to answer that question?
I don't think I can give you a hard line in terms of, the technical committee would absolutely agree that there is a point at which your spawning stock low spawning stock biomass will result in low recruitment. I mean, look at the beginning of the time series, that during the worst of the stock conditions, biomass was very low and recruitment was very low. And we are, as has been pointed out, nowhere near those levels of either SSB or recruitment, even in the below average recent years. But I couldn't say whether or not that line is 30,000 or not. The technical committee hasn't really looked at that kind of calculation.
Okay, public hearing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll now provide a summary of all the public comment we received on this addendum. We held 19 public hearings in all 12 states within the management unit for striped bass from Maine all the way to North Carolina, including PRFC. Really great attendance. Thank you, public, everybody that got involved in this process, spending your time and giving your input on striped bass management. There was approximately 875 attendees at all the hearings. Percentage breakdowns of attendees was 40% in New England, 44% in the Mid-Atlantic, and 16% from the Bay. I'm going to just run through sort of a general summary of all of the public hearings combined. With the briefing materials, there was public hearing summary tables provided that broke out support at each of the states. So this is just a general summary. So in terms of lots of participants from the recreational fishery at the hearings, they represent the majority opinion at the public hearings that we held. They are in support of adopting the new F reference points. A lot of comments about acting now, don't delay, reduce F to the target within 1 year. A majority support for the most conservative option in the document, which was one fish bag limit at 32-inch size. Some charter boats were in favor of a 2-fish bag limit, noting that that is what helps them sell trips, having the ability to have 2 fish. They were suggesting a 25% reduction from the commercial quota occur because that was the option in the document, but they noted that it should be from harvest because that's what the projections are suggested it's needed. They want to reduce mortality in all areas, including the Chesapeake Bay, and the sentiment of this group was manage for abundance and opportunity that creates. There were 2 other diverging opinions from that, which were from the commercial fishery, mainly that the data being used in the stock assessment are flawed. They favored either status quo or that incremental 777% reduction. And they are concerned about the economic impacts of the harvest reduction and that no socioeconomic impact analysis was conducted that would help them evaluate these options. And they noted that increasing striped bass populations may impact prey, as we heard some of the public comment about earlier. So in the other opinion came out of the Chesapeake Bay, which they expressed disappointment that the TC wasn't able to develop the F reference points specific to the Bay, that their harvest is predominantly on male, so a plan that would protect or ultimately increase SSB through harvest reductions would not have the benefits for the Bay. They favored the status quo or that incremental reduction, and they wanted to take reductions from 2012 harvest, noting they took a quota reduction from 2013 already, and they're concerned about disease and the prey for striped bass if populations of striped bass were to increase. A common issue that that came up at a lot of the public hearings was illegal harvest. A lot of comments about poaching. There was some note that the Coast Guard has done a good job trying to have more of a presence in the exclusive economic zone and controlling illegal activity there, but this job is not done. They recommended increasing fines and stepping up enforcement to get a better handle on this. Moving into the written comments that we received, we got over 3,800 public comments that were written. I have to give credit to my fellow staff members at the commission who helped me read through all of this, and thank you very much for your help. I couldn't have done it without all of them. And in terms of a breakdown of the comment, there's about 2,500 from form letters, 1,300 were personalized individual comments, and we got 34 letters from groups and organizations. And so here's a list of all the groups that submitted comments, and here's a list of representatives from states that also submitted comments on the plan. Now the public hearing, the public summary comment tables that I'm going to present here represent a total of all individuals in support of the options as I go through it. So this includes individuals, groups from the form letters, and also the public hearings. So that it's a grand total, if you will. So in terms of the reference points, strong support for adopting the new proposed from 2013 and use of the coastwide reference points for the Chesapeake Bay, support for North Carolina managing with their stock-specific assessment, with their SSB and F targets, and in terms of this timeline, whether to adjust the management trigger in Amendment 6 to allow for the 3-year, there was support to do it all in 1 year. A vast majority wanted to go through with the quickest time frame for the harvest reductions. Now, here we're getting into the proposed management program. So looking at those 3 different time frames, you can see a vast majority of comments were in support of doing it in 1 year, taking a 25% harvest reduction to achieve that 1-year time frame to reduce F. Now I'm going to go specifically into support for the options within the document. So for option B, this is the 1-year time frame, 25% harvest reduction. A lot of support, as I mentioned, for one fish bag limit, 32-inch size. That's option B3. There was some support for the 2 fish options as well, which I noted came from some of the for hire so that they could be able to sell trips. In terms of the Chesapeake Bay recreational harvest, there was options that supported a trophy fish, so that's where a majority of the support was for B13. And in terms of the commercial fishery options, there's only one option, B16, for the coastal, so there was support for that. And then for the Chesapeake Bay, there was support for taking the 25% reduction from 2013 quota, but I'll note that a lot of this was in support of sort of this general time frame from the recreational fisheries, so this doesn't necessarily reflect individuals from the Bay States. So in terms of option C, this is the 17% harvest reduction that reduces F to the target in 3 years. There is support, some support for the trophy fish option in this as well. Obviously a lot less support than the 1-year time frame. And then in terms of the Chesapeake Bay fishery, there was some support for the 2 fish bag at 20-inch minimum size. Once again, some support for option C in the commercial fisheries as well, but not nearly for the as much as the other time frame. Here's the incremental reduction. As I mentioned, this is at a lot of the Bay public hearings, this is the option that they were supporting. And so for the coastal recreational fishery, there was a little bit of support. And then in terms of the Chesapeake Bay recreational fishery, there was a fairly even breakdown of those options. And for the coastal commercial fishery, the support was taking the reduction from 2012 harvest, noting that the quota in 13 was already reduced. So the last two options that were in the document are the quota transfers, overwhelming support for no commercial quota transfers, leaving it status quo, noting that if the objective is to reduce mortality, just transferring quota to other states would not necessarily be in line with that. And then the commercial size limit, there was a lot of support for keeping the size limits as they currently are, noting that if they were changed, there would be discard mortality that could potentially offset any of the reductions. So there's quite a bit. Obviously, with so much public participation, so many comments received, not everything fit into the options within the document. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the general themes that came up through the public comments that were submitted. So both commercial and rec regs should reduce mortality. Poaching must be addressed. Require circle hooks. Do not allow striped bass. Do not allow or limit striped bass tournaments. The industry is seeing decline on the water. Declining striped bass populations will result in economic impacts to businesses, and also stricter fishing regulations will be a negative economic impact. Stock assessment biases result in uncertainty in the assessment results. Declare game fish status coast-wide, making striped bass fishery only recreational. Don't allow captain and crew to take striped bass on charter trips. The options only have a 50% probability of success, which is risky. The fishery should be catch and release only. None of the commercial scenarios achieve the necessary reduction, as we talked about. Stronger restrictions for the commercial fishery, e.g. a moratorium or a 50% reduction in the quota. Charter boats should not be regulated separately. Establish licensing fees to pay for additional law enforcement to get at the poaching issue. Don't allow transfer of commercial quota to be harvested recreationally through bonus fish programs. Take pressure off large breeding females and do not allow the take of trophy fish. Cut the coastal quota, increase the bay quota to save the blue crab industry. The Chesapeake Bay should not have a more liberal bag limit. Encourage the protection, maintenance, and enhancement of habitat. There's depletion of forage species preyed upon by the striped bass. Research mycobacteriosis and its impacts on the striped bass population. Set policy with the goal of increasing abundance, not maximizing harvest. Preserve the 2011 year class. Reevaluate fishing seasons and obtain reference points for the Chesapeake Bay. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions on the public comment summary? Okay. Tom, there you are again. There you are.
It must be a blind spot. I got two comments I'm going to make real fast. One is, it was interesting for me to go around with in the public hearings this time. The average attendance of the public hearings in New Jersey were about 50 people in the 3 public hearings, maybe a little more. I remember when we had striped bass public hearings, when I had 400 people at each hearing and we wound up being 1,200. I can remember with striped bass public hearing, we had over 900 people. And I guess a lot of those people spend their time on the internet. They need to get out. They need to come out to the public hearings. It's a place to basically change ideas and everything face to face, and I'm a little disappointed that we don't get that out there. The other thing I wanted to say was, it always amazes me is the professionalism of the people we find as staff. I mean, when they come up and do public hearings, I always look at these young men and women, they walk into a room, and at least when Russ and Adam and I go, we know all the people in the room, and they look around, they don't know really anybody. They might know me, and they did, and basically the way the courteous treatment they give the public, the answer to the questions, the patience they have, and they'll stay there as long as you want. So the commission's doing a good job of going and finding the right people to basically do that. That's what I wanted to get on the record.
Okay, and thank you for, I think, I definitely echo that sentiment. The work of the staff on this and the TC and our stock assessment committee has been absolutely incredible. So, further questions on this? I'll go to Laura and then Rob.
I'll tell you up front, it's not a question, but I hope that seeing as Tom made his very good comments, I realized Mike had a challenge and staff had a challenge taking all the public comments and putting them in categories, and I recognize that. I did want to say about our public hearing in Virginia, if I may, shortly.
Since you've got the mic, I'll give it to you.
Thank you. We were fairly strategic in Virginia, and we had our advisors there. So we had our 12 advisors, and they were really part of the public hearing. There was some public, not enough, I don't think, another dozen, but the 12 advisors were certainly the ones that have been kept up to pace on everything going on with this addendum for probably the last 8 or 9 months at every meeting we had. So I think their comments did reflect that they do like both recreational and commercial to do the 3-year approach at 777. They do like to have, if they have one fish, they would, go for that as far as one option, but that was split on 2 fishes to 21 inches. So I think it's important because it is hard for Mike to capture all that, but, these are the folks that spend time representing us, giving advice to our commission. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's true that commissioners are at all public hearings. Lauren.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for the excellent report. I believe early in the report there was reference made to comments from the Chesapeake Bay region concerning or relating concern for prey species for striped bass. This very day we heard at the public microphone comments about the ecosystem approach and perhaps linked to Menhaden. Can you elaborate on what the public said about prey species, please?
Yeah, the concern centered around there being enough forage for an increased striped bass population. And so the concern that if abundance were to increase for striped bass, would there be enough forage to support the health of the individuals of that population? And another concern that was noted was, would that potentially lead to disease as well if there wasn't enough forage in terms of menhaden, river herring, the shad species for an increased striped bass population.
Any other questions about the public comment? Lauren?
Yeah, follow up to that issue. Would it be reasonable to presume that the commentators concerned about prey species would support additional cuts in the harvest of menhaden from a commercial basis?
Yeah, to be honest, we didn't really get into the regulatory program for the prey species. It was just more of a concern of, will there be enough forage for an increased striped bass population? So you might be able to infer that that means to increase forage, the forage base for striped bass as well. But like I said, we didn't specifically get into comments on that.
Any other comments or questions on the public hearing? Any comments? Okay, thank you. Hold on. I think we're about time that we're going to approach our hard stop here. Kelly, how long is your presentation?
I haven't timed it. I would prefer to do it after lunch if that's what you're getting at, but because that would be quite out of sequence. I do have one comment relating to what Mr. Lustig just mentioned, but I was thinking I'd maybe save that after. What were you thinking about the advisory report right now?
That's what I was thinking, if you can do it in about 5 minutes, but if not?
Well, the only time frame I've heard mentioned to me, I think Mike mentioned it'd be nice to see 10 or 15 minutes, although he mentioned a 20, 25-minute thing. I haven't heard a 5-minute time frame. I could do whatever you need, Mr. Chairman. No, I've never heard the same time frame suggested to me yet, but I'll do whatever you need. I would prefer to do it after lunch, just because I was kind of not expecting that. But
okay, we'll let you do it after lunch, and we'll take the law enforcement report, and right after that, we'll break for lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the Law Enforcement Committee provided a few comments about the addendum at the August meeting, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We did review those again yesterday at our Law Enforcement Committee meeting, and I would only reemphasize the key issue for the Law Enforcement Committee really rests on the management option that would involve an incremental increase in whatever you're looking at, if it's a size limit or bag limit, that is not something that they would prefer to see done. So in this case, options that would implement change immediately or within a certain time frame and keep that change in place in terms of management options is what the Law Enforcement Committee would certainly prefer. And I think that's pretty much how we still view this, and that would conclude my comments.
Any board questions for law enforcement? Okay, we're going to suspend this meeting till after lunch, and we'll reconvene immediately afterwards. Thank you.